Okay, so here we are in the last section we called Systems Perspective. So we are looking at the second chapter of this perspective, which is called Coupled Infrastructure Systems. Remember, systems are characterized by feedbacks and interactions, and each component of the system cannot do what the system itself can do. So you are always creating new functions of coupled components, and they have feedbacks. I think you intuitively know, and we've discussed some examples before. So here the key concepts, we will see how to combine systems concepts with the institutional analysis and development framework, which we looked at way back in chapter 2 and applied it in many cases. Get introduced to infrastructure, so that will be natural, human-made, soft and hard and social infrastructure and human infrastructure as a general concept used as part of the framework to study human environment interactions. When we say infrastructure, typically you get the image of roads, bridges, dams, and so on, but actually there are also natural infrastructures like wetlands, and soft and hard infrastructures, and of course human infrastructure and social infrastructure as well. Starting with an example, deforested hill in Andhra Pradesh, India. When one of the authors, this is about the natural infrastructure, when one of the authors visited Andhra Pradesh, India as a guest of the NGO Foundation for Ecological Security, FES, he was informed of the progress communities in that region had made to restore their natural infrastructure. Over the years, grazing of livestock and collection of fuel wood had led to deforestation of the nearby hills. As a consequence, water was not being captured by the landscape and groundwater systems during rainstorms, so water was not being captured by the landscape and the groundwater system during rainstorms, but instead immediately began flowing down the hills into drainages, so small streams, and away from the villages. This has contributed to a shortage of water in the nearby villages, which also face severe poverty. As part of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, MNREGA as it's called, rural communities can receive funding to pay wage labor up to 100 days a year per person to contribute to public works. So that can correspond to non-rainy season, when there is either no farm work or you have no, you have your own land and you cannot do agriculture. So FES helps communities to compete for this funding for restoration of their degraded ecosystems. As a consequence, the community not only generates income but has also improved the capacity of their land to capture water and thus increase the productivity of their land in the long term. So you get soil quality, soil health improving, groundwater recharge, soil moisture persistence, crop yields going up, and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of positive feedbacks and can lead to triumph of the commons in this case, right? Let's look through the concepts we are going to discuss here. In this chapter, we'll discuss an extension of the IID framework that includes some of the insights from system science. Furthermore, it incorporates our long-term experience with studying current and historical irrigation systems around the world. We view irrigation systems as a model for many problems societies experience, just as the fruit fly is used as a basic model in genetics. So we view irrigation systems which are very ubiquitous even in urban settings for maintaining gardens, lawns, and of course for agriculture and so on. Fruit fly has got a genetic structure that is very good analog for our own system, and we can learn a lot by tinkering with its genetic material to see what does what. So we are obviously doing experiments on living things, but it's necessary for our own good. By this we mean that studying collective action problems in irrigation systems will teach us a lot about solving collective action problems in many other societal contexts. So systems means society and collective action and related feedbacks in the system. Moreover, we argue that many societal problems can be studied from a coupled infrastructure perspective. So we'll go back to the commons and societal problems once we learn here something about infrastructures, analyzing them, and in the IID framework, right? With infrastructure, we refer to collective structures that enable systems to produce certain outcomes. So each component cannot produce it, or if you build a road, it's just a road. But if people use it for transporting themselves or transporting goods and traveling and so on, then it's a part of the system, right, of the transportation network. Basic examples include roads, bridges, and electricity distribution systems, as well as internet communication protocols and computer software. We will discuss different types of infrastructure in the next section in more detail. A basic aspect of infrastructure is that it requires investment to create and maintain. So then we get back to the questions of who has access, how do you ensure equity, who pays for what, who benefits from the expenditure, and so on. In the case of public infrastructure such as roads, dams, electrical grid, electromagnetic spectrum that is shared, society must invest collectively to create and maintain the infrastructure. Who pays and who can use the infrastructure are critical collective choice questions, and there are rules for collective choice problems, dilemmas, whatever you want to call them, and goes back to a book from the 1870s, 1876, I think. It's called Robert's Law of something. We'll see in a Robert's Law. Okay, just remember that. We'll come back to it. Are new roads paid from a tax on gasoline or by all taxpayers? So who uses the roads, and should only the people who use the roads pay for the construction of roads, or should everybody pay for it? Is the road open to everyone then, or only for those who can pay the toll? So now the toll model is very new for maintaining roads by private entities typically, and you have to pay to get on that road. So what happens to those who cannot pay or do not want to pay, right? So let's look at different types of infrastructure before we close this podcast. Infrastructure is a general concept and can be described in physical terms or in economic terms. The most natural definition is the economic one. Infrastructure is a collection of materials such as machines and information such as knowledge about how to use those machines that can produce a stream of materials such as food, cars, houses, and information such as music and movies that the society values in the sense it'll pay for it. The second key feature of infrastructure is that it requires investment, a so-called opportunity cost, to produce and maintain. So machines must be built and maintained. Without practice, skills decline. And also, infrastructure typically has little value on its own right. So farm machinery isn't exciting in its own right. Its main value comes through its capacity to produce food. So use the technical term here called the opportunity cost, which means what? Which means if you invest in A, then you don't invest in B. Typically, it's a zero-sum game unless you have money for everything, or you consider all the critical infrastructure to be invested in, and then you're still left behind something. Let's say you build roads, but don't worry about protecting the forests or biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So opportunity cost is basically what you lose by investing in A and not exercising option B. Okay, simple. So it comes up in many contexts, I'm sure you've seen. Okay, so where was I? There are different forms of infrastructure that come together to produce the output. You can't operate farm machinery without knowledge, and we discuss these different forms of infrastructure in the following sections. They can all experience collective action challenges in order to be created and or maintained. So maybe I should leave the categories of infrastructure for the next podcast, because it's already about 10 minutes, but you get the idea that we are going from sustaining the commons, defining actions, action arenas, agents, biophysical context, outcomes, feedbacks. So we are in the systems perspective, And we're going to build the systems feedback because when you do sustaining the commons, you're almost always dealing with systems which include natural resources, users, rules and regulations, governments, and so on, which we will look at in a minute in a more formal way, especially because we want to look at the robustness of these infrastructures as well, right? In the adaptation, we discussed things like how to protect critical assets and public services against climate shocks by adapting. So here we are looking at the robustness. We discussed before the difference between resilience and robustness. Resilience is where a system is perturbed, it has some functional failures, and then it has to recover. So you are basically making sure that the system can recover to its full function and rapidly, whereas robustness is where a perturbation should not lead to dysfunctional situation, that the system which is robust should be able to function through the perturbation and continue to function. So there are differences that we discussed before. We'll discuss a little bit more in the coming podcasts. Okay.